Long before his name echoed across continents, Alexander was simply a boy of Macedon, a rugged land carved by wind, stone, and time. In the northern reaches of Greece, Macedon unfolded like a vast, untamed canvas, where nature itself seemed to train warriors long before they ever touched a sword. At dawn, the countryside awakened slowly. A thin veil of silver mist clung to the quiet villages, drifting lazily above the clay rooftops. Roosters crowed in the distance, shepherds guided their flocks along winding dirt paths, and the crisp, earthy scent of dew-soaked soil filled the air. The fields surrounding these villages stretched endlessly, golden and shimmering beneath the first touch of sunlight. To the west, dense Macedonian forests stood like ancient guardians. Towering oaks and pines created a cathedral of green, their leaves whispering stories older than the kingdom itself. Rays of sun filtered through the canopy in narrow beams, illuminating moss-covered stones and hidden trails trodden by hunters, soldiers, and travelers alike. These were forests where silence spoke louder than words, and where a young Alexander often wandered, learning to observe the world with a sharp, restless mind. Rivers flowed like silver threads across the land, winding gracefully through rocky valleys. Their waters murmured with the wisdom of centuries, carrying the reflections of distant snow-capped mountains. Every stream, every bend, every shifting current seemed to whisper a promise that destiny, like a river, carves its own path. And above all stood the mountains. Majestic and unforgiving, they watched over Macedon as eternal sentinels. Their peaks, drenched in golden light each morning, cast long shadows over the land, a reminder that greatness rises from harsh terrain. In this land of rugged beauty, where nature forged strength and resilience, the story of Alexander truly begins. The night the world held its breath. The city of Babylon glowed under a restless sky. Torches burned along its towering walls, flickering like trembling stars reflected in the canals that crisscrossed the ancient metropolis. Within the mighty palace of Nebuchadnezzar, a strange stillness crept through the halls. Servants whispered. Guards avoided one another's eyes. The air felt thick, so thick it seemed even the gods were watching. Because behind one set of heavy, carved doors, a king was dying. Not just any king, the king who shattered empires, who redrew the world, who had never known defeat. Alexander III of Macedon lay stretched across a cold marble bed, his breath shallow, his skin burning. Men who had once followed him through deserts and mountains now stood frozen, unable to accept what their eyes showed them. The conqueror of the known world trapped inside a failing body. The man who outran destiny now stood powerless before a mystery no sword could cut through. A feast that changed everything. Just days earlier, Babylon had been filled with music, wine, and celebration. Alexander had returned alive from the deadly Arabian campaign. His soldiers believed their king was preparing for another grand invasion, a march into Arabia that would open yet another chapter of conquests. Inside the palace, golden lamps glowed against walls painted with creatures of forgotten gods. Musicians played, wine poured freely, the air shimmered with excitement. Alexander, competitive as always, drank deeply as he exchanged stories with friends, generals, and companions. Then came the moment time refuses to forget. A final cup of wine, a sharp cry, a sudden clutch of the chest, a pain that shot through his body like lightning. The musicians stopped playing. The guests froze. Alexander's face twisted in agony, his body trembling, his voice echoing with a sound no one in that room would ever forget. Something had gone terribly wrong, something that would soon plunge the entire world into chaos. When the lion could no longer roar. At first, Alexander brushed off the pain. He had survived spear wounds, sword cuts, fever, exhaustion, and years of relentless war.
A single night of pain would not frighten a man who had once leapt alone into enemy lines. But this pain did not leave. It grew, it spread, and within hours the mighty king could barely stand. His limbs felt heavy, his voice weakened, his fever burned like molten iron beneath his skin. When the sun rose the next morning, Alexander could no longer rise from his bed. Outside, soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. Rumors swept through marketplaces. Babylon, a city accustomed to the grand presence of kings, now trembled with fear. For this was a king people believed could not die. Inside the palace chambers, the atmosphere thickened. Alexander's generals crowded beside him, unable to meet each other's eyes. Physicians whispered conflicting theories. Friends and companions watched their invincible leader shrink into weakness. It was as if the universe itself refused to explain what was happening. Whispers in the torchlight. As days passed, Babylon turned into a boiling pot of rumors. Every whisper seemed louder than the last. Some swore Alexander had been poisoned. Others claimed a curse had followed him from the deserts of Arabia. Many spoke of omens, strange shadows, dying birds, and unnatural silence in the royal gardens. But one prophecy terrified them more than anything else. Long ago, a wise man had warned Alexander that if he ever entered Babylon again, he would die there. And now, here he was, dying, slowly, unexplainably. His generals, already haunted by fear of the future, tried to silence the prophecy. But secrets have a way of leaking through walls, and soon all of Babylon began to believe the king's fate was sealed by forces far beyond human reach. A body betrayed. Alexander's condition grew worse. He could no longer walk. He could barely lift his head. Sweat drenched his sheets. His breathing grew more uneven, but the most heartbreaking detail was this. Alexander's mind remained sharp. He heard everything. He understood everything. He saw the terror in the eyes of those he trusted most. Yet he could barely speak. The conqueror of Persia, Egypt, and half the world had become a silent prisoner inside his own failing flesh. His generals panicked. His friends prayed. His empire trembled. Because there was something else they feared far more than Alexander's death: the world without him. The king who watched death approach. During these final days, Alexander did something extraordinary. He asked to be taken to the courtyard. Carried on his bed, too weak to stand, he was placed before thousands of soldiers who gathered in silence. They watched their king, pale and trembling, struggle to raise a hand. He succeeded, barely. And in that moment, the entire army understood. Their lion was dying. Their sun was setting. Their world was collapsing. The soldiers cried openly. Hard warriors who had crossed continents with him fell to their knees. Babylon's air shook with grief. Alexander, unable to speak, looked at them with a mixture of pride, sorrow, and something deeper, an understanding that his death would unleash storms greater than any he had ever faced. Storms that would tear apart the world he built.
The empire begins to tremble. Inside the grand halls of Babylon, the mood shifted from fear to something far more dangerous: ambition. Alexander's generals, men who had built their fortunes and reputations under his shadow, began to whisper among themselves. Not openly, not loudly, quietly, carefully, like wolves circling a wounded lion. Outside the palace, soldiers slept with their weapons close. Inside, power hung in the air so thick it could be tasted. The question everyone feared most now grew louder with every passing hour. Who would rule the greatest empire ever forged? Alexander had no legitimate adult heir. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but months away from giving birth. His half-brother Aridius was alive, but mentally unfit to rule. An empire stretching from Greece to India was about to be left without a captain. And everyone knew what happens to a ship without a captain. It sinks. The last night of the conqueror. As Alexander's condition worsened, the palace grew quieter. Servants moved like ghosts. Even the birds in the palace gardens seemed to stop singing. Babylon held its breath. Torches flickered against stone walls as Alexander lay shivering beneath blankets that could no longer warm him. His once sharp blue eyes dimmed, and his breath came in short, uneven gasps. Physicians hovered nearby, their faces painted with helplessness. They had no cure, no remedy, no explanation. Some believed it was poison, slow, precise, designed to torture rather than kill instantly. Something placed in his wine by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Others insisted it was illness, fever, infection, or the punishment of years of pushing a human body beyond its limits. But in that moment, only one truth mattered. Alexander was slipping away. A king who had marched through deserts without water, who had faced armies larger than his own, who had survived assassination attempts, was now powerless against something no one could see. The silent goodbyes. One by one, his closest companions entered the room to see him for the final time. Ptolemy, who had fought beside him since childhood, knelt silently, tears clinging to his beard. Seleucus, the brilliant general who had mapped regions no Greek had ever seen before, whispered a prayer. Cassander, son of the powerful regent Antipater, stood stiffly in the shadows, his expression unreadable, his thoughts a mystery. Hephaestion's absence haunted the room. Alexander's closest friend, his sole companion, had died months earlier, and some believed Alexander's heart had never healed from that wound. Now the king's red cloak rested beside him, and his weapons lay untouched. His sword, once unstoppable, now reflected only the dim, dying light of the room. Alexander tried speaking, but the words refused to form. His voice had abandoned him. But his eyes still burned with a fire refusing to let go. The generals gathered, the lamps dimmed, the night deepened, and then, in a breath so soft it barely disturbed the air around him, Alexander stopped breathing. The king was gone. The world after the king. The moment Alexander died, the palace erupted, not with screams, but with a suffocating silence. A silence so heavy it pressed into the walls themselves. Outside, thousands of soldiers waited for news. When it finally came, the sound that rose from the ranks was unlike anything Babylon had ever heard. Brave men cried openly. Some collapsed, others howled in anguish. The world had lost its brightest flame. The empire had lost its master. History had just shattered. Inside the palace, however, the mood was different. Grief lasted only minutes. Ambition returned like a tide. The generals, men who owed everything to Alexander, turned on one another almost immediately. Plans were laid, voices raised, hands floated toward swords. Some demanded the unborn child be king. Others supported Aridius. Some insisted the empire be divided. Alexander's body had barely cooled, yet the men he trusted were already carving up his dream. The restless corpse of a king. The story of Alexander's death does not end with his final breath. According to ancient accounts, his body showed no signs of decay for several days after his death. His skin remained warm, his face looked alive,
his features unchanged. Whispers spread like wildfire. Was Alexander really dead? Or was he in a coma? Or touched by the gods? Or cursed to linger between life and death? Some believed he was so powerful that even death hesitated to claim him. Others believed something more sinister. Perhaps Alexander was buried alive. Historians still argue about this chilling possibility. The final journey of the immortal king. Alexander's body was eventually placed inside a magnificent golden sarcophagus, then into a larger golden casket, transported by a massive carriage pulled by 64 mules. It was designed to travel to Macedonia, back to the land of his birth. But it never arrived. Ptolemy, one of his most loyal generals, intercepted the funerary procession and diverted the body to Egypt. He believed Alexander himself would have preferred Egypt, a place he admired, a land where he had been crowned as a living god. Alexander's tomb became a place of pilgrimage, power, and wonder. And then it vanished. To this day, the resting place of the greatest conqueror in history remains one of the world's greatest unsolved mysteries. The question that never dies. More than 2,000 years later, scholars, archaeologists, scientists, designers, and histories continue to debate the truth of Alexander's death. Was he murdered? Was he poisoned? Was it disease? Or was it something deeper? A prophecy fulfilled, a destiny completed? We may never know the final answer, but one thing is certain. Alexander the Great, even in death, achieved the one feat no other conqueror has ever matched. He became eternal. His empire collapsed. His generals fought on one another for pieces of his legacy. His army scattered. His power vanished. But his story? His legend, his mystery, those will outlive every kingdom ever built. Alexander may have died in Babylon, but the world never stopped speaking his name.